This 4-year-old street urchin finds a millionaire and his newborn son drowning in the flood. But she appears behind them and does something incredible. Rate my story from 0 to 10 in the comments. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The rain hammered against the asphalt of Charleston with a force no one had anticipated. What began as a common thunderstorm turned into a catastrophe when the Ashley River overflowed its banks, invading the city's historic district like a furious serpent. Cars floated down King Street like broken toys, and despair echoed among the cries of people trapped in their vehicles. Bennett Sterling gripped the steering wheel of his black Escalade with enough force to turn his knuckles white. At 52, the real estate mogul had never faced a situation like this. In the back seat, his newborn son Hayes cried inconsolably in his car seat, while the dirty water began to seep into the car's interior from under the doors. "This can't be happening," Bennett muttered, trying to start the engine, which sputtered and died with each attempt. The water was already up to his ankles, and panic began to overwhelm his rational thoughts. He had left home only to check on some properties downtown, leaving Eleanor resting at home after a difficult birth. Now, he bitterly regretted bringing the baby along. A few yards away, hidden under the awning of an abandoned boutique, a small figure watched the scene with large, attentive eyes. Juniper was only 4 years old, but her eyes carried a maturity beyond her years. Her brown hair was tangled and dirty, and her clothes, an old T-shirt and torn shorts, revealed the 2 years she had spent living on the streets of Charleston since her mother mysteriously disappeared. The girl knew these turbulent waters well. She had learned to swim in the Cooper River that cut through the shantytown where she was born, long before her life turned into a daily struggle for survival. Her little bare feet were accustomed to running on dangerous ground, and her small hands had become adept at finding food and shelter where others could not. When she saw the well-dressed man struggling desperately inside the slowly sinking car, something stirred within Juniper. It wasn't pity. She had learned that pity was a luxury she couldn't afford. It was something more primal, more instinctive. The baby's cries pierced the air like a blade, mingling with the father's desperate shouts. Without thinking twice, Juniper threw herself into the cold, turbulent water. Her little legs kicked against the current with steely determination, while her arms cut through the water with precise movements she had perfected during countless swims in the river. The dirty water filled her mouth, but she spat it out and continued swimming towards the car. Bennett saw her approaching and, for a moment, thought he was hallucinating. A child. An apparently abandoned girl coming towards him. The absurdity of the situation almost made him laugh, if not for the terror he felt for his son, who was crying weaker and weaker in the back seat. "Get out of here, kid!" he shouted, but Juniper had already reached the car window. Her small, nimble hands worked quickly to open the back door, which yielded with a metallic creak. Water flooded the vehicle with even greater force. But the girl did not hesitate. She grabbed the car seat with Hayes inside and raised it above her head, keeping it out of the water. That's when Bennett felt the world spin. The stress, fear, and adrenaline finally took their toll. His eyes closed and his body relaxed, causing him to slip into the water that now completely filled the car's interior. Juniper saw the man faint and knew she had only seconds to act. With strength seemingly impossible for her frail body, she held the car seat with one hand and grabbed Bennett's shirt with the other. Her lungs burned for lack of air, but she refused to let go of either of them. Swimming with desperate movements, she dragged them away from the sinking car, towards an emergency staircase of a nearby building. Each stroke was a battle against the current, which tried to pull them back into the chaotic waters. Her little legs kicked furiously and her shoulders ached with the weight of the 2 bodies she carried. When she finally managed to drag both to a safe, elevated spot, Juniper collapsed on the concrete floor, panting and shaking. Hayes had stopped crying and was staring at her with curious eyes, as if he realized that this dirty, wet girl had saved his life. Bennett remained unconscious, but breathed regularly. It was there, sitting on the cold floor while watching the wealthy man and the baby she had just saved, that Juniper made a decision that would forever change the course of their 4 lives. She didn't know it yet, but that moment of desperate courage would be just the first of many challenges they would face together. The storm continued to rage outside, but something had changed irrevocably in those few minutes of chaos and heroism. Bennett awoke with the bitter taste of dirty water in his mouth and a throbbing pain in his head. For a few seconds, he couldn't process where he was or what had happened. His eyes slowly focused on the small figure sitting next to him, holding his son in her arms with almost maternal care. "Hayes," he murmured, trying to get up quickly, but stopped by an overwhelming dizziness. "He's okay," Juniper said in her small but firm voice. "He was just hungry. Stop crying when I did this." She gently rocked the baby, who did seem calmer in her skinny arms. Bennett observed her more closely for the first time. The girl couldn't be more than 4 years old, but there was something in her dark eyes that suggested experiences far beyond her age. Her clothes were soaked and torn, her tangled hair hung over her dirty face, and her bare feet were bruised and calloused. You saved us," he said, still trying to grasp the magnitude of what had happened. "How? Why?" Juniper shrugged, as if saving lives was commonplace in her routine. "I can swim, and babies can't die in the water." The brutal simplicity of her answer hit Bennett like a punch. Here was a clearly abandoned child, living on the streets, who had risked her own life to save 2 strangers. He, who throughout his life had crossed paths with beggars and homeless people without giving them a second look, was alive thanks to the courage of one of them. "What's your name?" he asked, sitting up with difficulty. "Juniper," she replied without taking her eyes off Hayes. "And you?" "Bennett, and this is my son Hayes." He paused, watching how she held the baby with impressive naturalness. "Where are your parents, Juniper?" The girl's face closed immediately. "I don't have parents, just me. But you must live somewhere." "I live where I can," she said, finally looking directly at him. "Sometimes under the river bridge, sometimes in the park, sometimes under the overpass." Bennett felt a pang in his chest he couldn't explain. He looked around and realized the water was slowly receding, but still covered much of the streets. Sirens wailed in the distance, and he knew emergency services would take hours to reach them. "Juniper," he said carefully, "you saved our lives. I can't just leave you here." "Sure you can," she replied pragmatically. "I'm always alone. Not this time." The decision came out of his mouth before he could fully think it through. "I'm going to take you home with me." Juniper looked at him suspiciously. "Why?" Because it's the right thing to do," Bennett said, surprised by his own words. Throughout his life, doing the right thing had always been synonymous with looking after his own interests. Now, for the first time, he felt he owed something to someone. "What if your wife doesn't like me?" The question caught him off guard. How could a 4-year-old have so much clarity about the complexities of adult relationships? "She'll understand," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "You saved our baby. That means a lot." Juniper remained silent for a long time, cradling Hayes, who had fallen asleep in her arms. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a sadness that broke Bennett's heart. "I used to live in a house before with my mom, but she left and never came back. Houses aren't forever for people like me." "This one will be," Bennett promised, not knowing if he could keep such a promise. 2 hours later, when they finally managed to get out of there with the help of the firefighters, Bennett called Eleanor from the hospital, where they took Hayes for a preventive checkup. "Eleanor, I need to tell you what happened," he said, watching Juniper sitting in a chair in the hallway, still holding Hayes's hand, who was sleeping in a nurse's lap. "My God, Bennett, I was desperate. The news says the city center is flooded, and you weren't answering the phone." "We're fine," Hayes is fine, but there's something else. He took a deep breath. A girl saved us. A 4-year-old who lives on the streets. She risked her life to get us out of the sinking car. Silence on the other end of the line. Eleanor? I'm here. You said, a street child? Yes, and I brought her with me. I couldn't abandon her after what she did. Bennett, you can't just bring a stranger into our house. We have a newborn. We have to think about safety. She saved our son, he exploded, causing some people in the hospital to turn around. She's 4 years old, Eleanor, 4 years old, and has been living alone on the streets for God knows how long. I'm not going to abandon her. This is temporary, right? Until we find a suitable family for her. Bennett looked again at Juniper, who had gotten up and was making funny faces at Hayes through the nursery glass, eliciting giggles from the baby. Yes, he lied, temporary. But deep down, as he watched the girl who had changed everything in a matter of minutes, Bennett suspected that nothing in their lives would be temporary again. Little Juniper had entered their lives like a hurricane, and something told him that the storm was just beginning. When they arrived at the Sterling mansion 2 hours later, Eleanor was waiting for them at the door with an expression that wavered between curiosity and resistance. Juniper hid behind Bennett, her survival instincts alerting her to the tension in the air. Eleanor Sterling remained motionless in the doorway, her blue eyes scanning every detail of the dirty child her husband had brought home. At 35, she had always imagined what it would be like to have a daughter, but certainly not like this. Juniper clung to Bennett's leg, her dark eyes studying the elegant woman in front of her with the same intensity with which she was observed. "This is Eleanor, my wife," Bennett said, his voice carrying a tension that Juniper picked up on immediately. "Eleanor, this is Juniper." "Hi," murmured the girl, her voice almost inaudible. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She was used to having control over her home, her routines, her perfectly organized life. The presence of that child represented the chaos she so feared. But when Hayes started crying in Bennett's arms, something unexpected happened. Juniper let go of Bennett's leg and approached the baby. "Can I?" she asked, holding out her arms. "No," Eleanor said quickly, but Bennett had already passed Hayes into the girl's arms. To everyone's surprise, Hayes stopped crying instantly. Juniper began to hum a soft melody, rocking the baby with natural movements that seemed instinctive. It was a sad song, in a minor key, that spoke about lost birds looking for their nests. "How does she know how to do that?" Eleanor whispered to Bennett. "I don't know," he replied, equally impressed. "She's been taking care of him since she saved us. It's like it's natural for her," Eleanor completed, feeling something strange stir in her chest. For years, Eleanor had tried to get pregnant without success. She had undergone countless treatments, taken hormones that made her feel like a stranger in her own body, endured the pity disguised as friendship from women who had children easily. When she finally managed to carry Hayes to the end of the gestation, after 2 devastating losses that she kept secret, she swore she would be the most protective mother in the world. Now, watching an abandoned child take care of her son better than she could, she felt a confusing mixture of gratitude and resentment. "She needs to take a bath," Eleanor said finally, her practical voice masking her contradictory emotions. "And eat something. When was the last time you ate, Juniper?" The girl thought seriously about the question. "Yesterday morning. Found half a sandwich in the shopping center trash." The words hit Eleanor like a slap. Half a sandwich from the trash. While she complained when dinner wasn't exactly to her liking, a 4-year-old child was feeding on scraps. "Come," she said, her voice softer. "We'll give you a bath, and then you can eat." Juniper hesitated, looking at Bennett for confirmation. When he nodded, she followed Eleanor up the mansion's marble staircase, her eyes wide with wonder, absorbing every detail of the luxury that surrounded her. The guest suite bathroom was bigger than any place Juniper had ever slept. The white porcelain bathtub looked like a miniature lake, and the soft towels were fluffier than any blanket she had ever used. "Do you know how to bathe yourself?" Eleanor asked, turning on the faucets. "I do. I always took a bath alone in the river." Eleanor felt her chest tighten again. "Well, you don't have to worry about that here. The water will always be clean and warm." While Juniper was taking a bath, Eleanor went downstairs to talk to Bennett, who was in the office making calls to check on the damage to his properties. "Bennett, we need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. "If it's about Juniper staying here, I'm not discussing it," he said, without looking up from the papers. "She saved our son. That's worth something." "It's not that." Eleanor sat in the armchair in front of his desk. "It's about what this means, for us, for Hayes." "What do you mean?" "Bennett, have you stopped to think about what might have happened to her parents? Children don't just appear on the streets. Someone will look for her, Child Protective Services, relatives. What if no one looks?" he asked, finally looking at her. "What if she really has no one?" Eleanor was silent. The truth was that in the few minutes she had watched Juniper taking care of Hayes, she had felt something she hadn't felt in years, the feeling of seeing a complete family. "She has something different," Eleanor said finally, "the way she remembers things, the way she observes everything. It's like she records every detail. I noticed that too. At the hospital, she described to the nurse exactly what everyone we saw on the street during the flood was wearing, with details even I didn't notice. At that moment they heard footsteps coming down the stairs. Juniper appeared in the office doorway, wearing Eleanor's pajamas, which were huge on her, her clean hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. "The baby's crying," she said simply. Bennett and Eleanor exchanged glances. Neither of them had heard Hayes cry. "How do you know?" Eleanor asked. "I can hear him from here." "Can't you hear?" They rushed to the baby's room, where they indeed found Hayes awake and starting to get fussy. Juniper approached the crib and began humming the same melody as before. Hayes calmed down immediately, his little eyes fixed on the girl's face. "How does she do that?" Bennett murmured. "I don't know," Eleanor replied, but there was something in her voice that Bennett couldn't identify. That night, after Juniper fell asleep in the guest room, Eleanor stayed awake watching Hayes sleep peacefully. For the first time since her son's birth, he had slept more than 2 hours straight without waking up crying. When Bennett came to check on the baby, he found his wife sitting in the armchair next to the crib, a thoughtful expression on her face. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how our life has completely changed in one day," she replied. "And about how she seems to have arrived exactly when we needed her. Do you think it was coincidence?" Eleanor looked at her husband, her eyes shining with an emotion he couldn't decipher. "Bennett, I never told you, but before I managed to get pregnant with Hayes, I lost 2 babies. The silence that followed was filled with revelation and pain. Bennett approached his wife, trying to process the information she had kept to herself for so long. "Why did you never tell me?" "Because I was afraid you'd leave me, that you'd think I was defective." "Eleanor, today, watching her take care of Hayes, I thought maybe she came to teach us something about being a family, about taking care of each other." But as she spoke those words, Eleanor couldn't imagine that, on the other side of town, a woman named Natalie had just been released from a rehab clinic and was beginning a desperate search for the daughter she hadn't seen in 2 years. 3 weeks had passed since Juniper arrived at the Sterling mansion, and the house routine had completely transformed. The girl woke up every morning before dawn, a habit developed during her years on the streets when she needed to find the best places to get food before other homeless people arrived first. Eleanor began to wake up at the same time, initially to check if Juniper was okay, but then because she discovered she liked those quiet moments in the kitchen, preparing coffee while watching the girl draw in notebooks that Bennett had bought for her. Juniper's drawings were extraordinary for a child her age. They weren't the typical colourful scribbles of a 4-year-old, but detailed and accurate representations of everything she observed. She drew the house inside and out, with an impressive perspective, captured facial expressions of Bennett and Eleanor with strokes that revealed emotions they themselves didn't know they were displaying. "She has a photographic memory," Bennett commented one morning, observing a drawing that Juniper had made of the entire block where they lived, including details such as the number of windows in each house and the exact position of each tree on the sidewalk. "It's more than that," Eleanor said, pouring coffee for her husband. "She remembers entire conversations, word for word. Yesterday, she repeated a conversation we had 3 days ago, exactly as it happened." Bennett frowned. "Is that normal?" "I don't know. Maybe we should take her to a doctor." At that moment, Juniper entered the kitchen carrying Hayes, who had started crying in the room. In 3 weeks, she had become more efficient than any babysitter at calming the baby. Hayes simply stopped crying when she approached, as if he recognized a familiar and reassuring presence. "He was hungry," Juniper said, sitting in the high chair that Bennett had made especially for her. "And there's a man outside looking at the house." Bennett and Eleanor exchanged glances. "What man?" Bennett asked. "A bald man with a blue shirt. He's been standing across the street for about 15 minutes. He's looking mainly at the upstairs windows." Bennett got up and went to the living room window from where he could see the street. In fact, there was a middle-aged man observing the house, writing something in a small notebook. "Who could it be?" Eleanor murmured, joining her husband. "I don't know, but I don't like this." The man remained there for another 10 minutes before leaving, but the incident left everyone uneasy. Bennett hired a discreet security guard to watch the property, justifying to himself that it was a normal precaution for someone who had just brought an unknown child home. In fact, Bennett was beginning to realize that his feelings for Juniper had evolved far beyond the initial gratitude. The girl had awakened in him a protective instinct he didn't know he possessed. When she laughed, something rare but genuine when it happened, he felt a deep satisfaction. When she was too quiet, absorbed in memories that clearly disturbed her, he felt a powerless rage against whoever was responsible for putting her in that situation. Eleanor, in turn, was facing a complex internal battle. Each passing day, she saw Juniper become more essential to the functioning of the house, more connected with Hayes, more a daughter. But along with that growing sense of motherhood came a devastating guilt for the years she had ignored children in similar situations on the streets of the city. It was during one of those introspective mornings that Juniper made an observation that changed everything. "Uncle Bennett," she said, using the title she had spontaneously adopted for him, "I've seen you before." Bennett stopped reading the newspaper. "What do you mean, sweetie?" "Before I lived here. You went to the place where I lived with my mom." "Where did you live?" Juniper was silent for a moment, her dark eyes focused on something distant. "It was a little wooden house near the river, small, but it was ours. It had a window that looked out onto the water. My mum planted flowers outside." Eleanor felt her heart race. "And you saw Bennett there?" "Yes, I did. He was with other men in suits. They had papers in their hands and were pointing at our house. My mum got very sad after they left." Bennett felt his blood run cold. In the past 5 years, his construction company had participated in several urban renewal projects that involved removing irregular constructions near the river. It was part of the job, he had always justified to himself, cleaning up degraded areas to build developments that would enhance the region. "When did this happen, Juniper?" he asked, his voice tenser. "Before my mom left. I think about 3 years ago. I was littler." "And what happened after you moved?" Juniper's face closed. "We couldn't find a place to live. We stayed in a shelter for a while, but it was very crowded and noisy. Then we stayed on the street. And then—" her voice failed. "Then my mom disappeared." Eleanor looked at Bennett and saw in his eyes the same horrified realization she was having. It was possible that his work had indirectly contributed to the situation that landed Juniper on the streets. "Juniper," Eleanor said carefully, "do you remember your mother's name?" "Natalie. Natalie Santos. She was the most beautiful mom in the world, and she just disappeared. One day I woke up, and she wasn't there anymore. I waited 3 days in the same spot, but she didn't come back. Then the people at the shelter said I had to go somewhere else, but I ran away. I thought if I stayed on the streets, she could find me when she came back." The devastating innocence of the explanation made Eleanor cover her mouth with her hands to stifle a sob. A 2-year-old child had spent 3 days alone, waiting for her mother, and then had survived 2 years on the streets, hoping to be found. "Did you ever hear anything about her again?" Bennett asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "No, but I know she didn't leave me because she wanted to. My mom loved me. She must have gotten lost or sick or—" Juniper paused, looking at the 2 adults. "Do you think she's still looking for me?" The question hung in the air, like a silent accusation. Eleanor abruptly got up from the table, mumbled an excuse about checking on Hayes, and left the kitchen. Bennett was left alone with Juniper, who watched him with those big, intelligent eyes that seemed to see much more than they should. "Uncle Bennett," she said finally, "are you sad because of what I said?" "No, sweetie. I'm just thinking about how to help find my mom." The hope in Juniper's voice was like a stab in Bennett's heart. How could he explain to a 4-year-old that maybe her mother didn't want to be found? Or worse, that maybe she couldn't be found? "Let's talk about it later, okay?" Later that day, when Juniper was sleeping, Bennett and Eleanor had the most difficult conversation of their marriage. "I need to investigate," Bennett said. "I need to find out what really happened to Natalie Santos. What if we find out she's alive? What if she wants Juniper back?" Bennett looked at his wife and saw in her eyes the same fear he felt. In 3 weeks, Juniper had become part of their lives in a way neither of them had imagined possible. The thought of losing her was almost unbearable. "Then we'll have to face that situation when it comes," he said. "But Eleanor, do you realize what this means? If my company was responsible for displacing her family—" "It wasn't your fault," Eleanor said quickly. "You didn't know. But now I do. And that changes everything." That night, while Bennett was making calls to private investigators, neither of them knew that on the other side of town, Natalie Santos had just discovered the address of the family that had taken in a 4-year-old girl after the flood, and that she was planning to show up at their door the next morning. The doorbell rang at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, a sound that cut through the morning silence of the mansion like an alarm. Bennett was in the office answering emails when he heard Eleanor quickly descend the stairs to answer the door. There was something urgent in the way she walked that made him get up from his chair and go to the office window, from where he could partially see the main entrance. A thin woman with brown hair tied in a disheveled ponytail was standing at the door. She wore faded jeans and a simple blouse, and held a folder of documents against her chest, as if it were a protective shield. Even from a distance, Bennett could see that she was trembling slightly. "My name is Natalie Santos," he heard the woman's voice through the half-open door. "I've come to get my daughter." Bennett's world stopped. For the past few weeks, he had hired 2 different investigators to find Natalie Santos, but both had returned without concrete leads. And now she was there, at his door, claiming Juniper. Eleanor stood motionless for a few seconds before answering. "Your daughter? Juniper? I know she's here. Someone told me a wealthy family took in a 4-year-old girl after the flood." Natalie's voice grew in intensity, charged with a mixture of despair and determination. "I've come to get her." Bennett ran down the stairs, reaching the door as Eleanor stepped aside to let him handle the situation. When he saw Natalie up close, his heart ached. She was an older and worn-down version of Juniper, The same intense dark eyes, the same delicate bone structure, but marked by years of suffering that had left premature wrinkles and a sickly pallor. "Ms. Santos," he said, trying to keep his voice controlled, "please come in. We have a lot to talk about." Natalie hesitated at the doorstep, her eyes scanning the luxurious interior of the house. "I just want my daughter back." "Where is she?" "She's safe and well cared for," Eleanor replied, joining them in the living room. "But we need to understand, where have you been for the past 2 years? Natalie's face contorted in pain. "Institutionalized, against my will." Her voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "My cousin Marcelo convinced me to sign some papers. He said it was to get government assistance, but they were papers for admission to a rehabilitation clinic. He said I was an addict, that I wasn't fit to take care of Juniper." "And were you an addict?" Bennett asked directly. Natalie stared at him with an intensity that made him take a half step back. "I took tranquilizers to sleep. After we lost our house, after we were on the streets, I couldn't sleep anymore. I was afraid someone would hurt Juniper if I slept. So I took medicine to get a few hours of rest." "That doesn't justify a 2-year commitment," Eleanor said, softening her tone. "It really doesn't, but Marcelo had other plans." The bitterness in Natalie's voice was palpable. "He wanted me to sign the transfer of the inheritance I received from my grandmother. A small rural property that's worth some money. With the commitment, he got power of attorney and sold everything." Bennett felt a familiar anger rise in his chest. It was the same indignation he felt when he discovered fraud in his constructions, but amplified by the emotional proximity to the situation. "And how did you get out of the clinic?" "A lawyer from the Human Rights Center managed to annul the commitment. They proved that I was deceived, that I didn't need compulsory commitment." Natalie opened the folder she was carrying and took out some documents. "I have all the papers here. I'm Juniper's legal mother. I have the right to take her with me." At that moment, small footsteps descended the stairs. Juniper appeared in the living room wearing the pink pajamas that Eleanor had bought for her, her hair still disheveled from sleep. When she saw Natalie, she was paralyzed at the entrance to the room. "Mommy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Natalie got up from the armchair as if she had been struck by an electric shock. Tears began to stream down her face as she stretched out her arms. "My princess." "Mommy is here." But Juniper didn't run into her mother's arms as everyone expected. Instead, she looked nervously at Bennett and Eleanor, as if asking for permission or protection. The 2 years on the streets had taught her to be cautious of strangers, and no matter how much she recognized her mother's face, Natalie had become a stranger. "Juniper," Natalie said, confused by her daughter's hesitation. "It's me, Mommy. Do you remember me?" "I remember," Juniper said finally, but she didn't move. "But you left. You left me alone." The innocent accusation hit Natalie like a slap. She knelt on the floor, getting down to her daughter's height. "I didn't want to leave, my love. Bad people took me away from you. I fought every day to come back. Why did it take so long?" It was a simple question, asked with the direct logic of a child, but one that didn't have a simple answer. How could she explain to a 4-year-old the bureaucratic mechanisms that had separated a family? How could she justify 2 years of involuntary abandonment? Because sometimes adults do complicated things that hurt children unintentionally, Natalie said, struggling to find the right words. "But now I'm here. Now I can take care of you again." Juniper looked again at Bennett and Eleanor. During the past month, they had become her benchmark for safety and stability. The house had clear rules, food on time, a room of her own, and most importantly, Hayes, whom she had learned to love like a younger brother. "Can I stay here?" she asked Bennett. "With you and Aunt Eleanor and Hayes." The question broke the hearts of all the adults present, each for different reasons. Natalie saw her daughter choose strangers over her. Bennett and Eleanor saw a child who had found stability being forced to choose between 2 families. "Juniper," Bennett said, crouching down to get to her height too. This is your real mum. She loves you very much, and she came to get you. But I don't want to leave, Juniper said, her first tears starting to flow. I like living here. I take care of Hayes. He needs me. Princess, Natalie said, her voice trembling. I know you're confused, but I'm your real family. We had a life together before all this happened. A life on the street, Juniper said with the brutal honesty typical of children. Here, I have a room and food, and no one hurts me. The silence that followed was filled with pain and complications that seemed impossible to resolve. Eleanor was crying silently, clinging to Bennett's arm. Natalie seemed to be falling apart, confronted with the fact that her daughter had found a better life away from her. It was Bennett who finally broke the silence. Miss Santos, Natalie, maybe we can find a solution that works for everyone. What kind of solution? She asked, suspiciously. Juniper has been through a lot of changes in the last 2 years. Maybe it's better to make this transition gradually. You could visit her here, spend time together, rebuild the bond. Are you suggesting that I leave my daughter with you? Natalie's voice rose an octave. After everything I've been through to get her back, I'm suggesting that we think about what's best for Juniper, Bennett said firmly. She's been through trauma. She's found stability here. Tearing her away abruptly can cause more damage. Natalie looked at her daughter, who had hidden behind Eleanor's legs, and for the first time since she had arrived, she seemed to really see the situation through Juniper's eyes. Her daughter was clean, well-fed, wearing expensive clothes, clearly cared for with affection, and more importantly, she seemed happy. I don't have a place to live, Natalie admitted finally, her voice breaking. I don't have money. I don't have a job. Marcelo sold everything I had. We can help with that too, Eleanor said impulsively, ignoring Bennett's surprised look. We can help you get established, find work. Why would you do that? Natalie asked, suspicious. Because Juniper saved us first, Bennett said, and because we already love her like a daughter. Bennett's honest confession changed something in the atmosphere of the room. For the first time, Natalie saw that these people really cared about Juniper. They weren't trying to steal her daughter out of whim or power. I want time with her, Natalie said finally. I won't give up my right to be her mother. And you shouldn't, Eleanor agreed. But let's find a way to do it that doesn't scare Juniper. That was how the most delicate and emotionally charged negotiation that any of them had ever faced began. And none of the adults realized that Juniper was absorbing every word, every emotion, every detail of the conversation, recording everything in her extraordinary memory to process later, when she was alone. 2 weeks after the first meeting with Natalie, the tension in the Sterling house had become almost palpable. The daily visits from Juniper's biological mother began as 2-hour meetings in the main living room, always supervised by Bennett or Eleanor, but gradually turned into something more complex and emotionally charged. Juniper was confused. During the first few days, she barely spoke when Natalie was present, limiting herself to short answers and nervous glances. But slowly, fragments of memories began to return. The way Natalie hummed a specific song while combing her hair, the sweet smell of the cheap perfume she wore, the way she told stories before bed. "Mommy," Juniper said during one of those visits, "do you remember the story of the little bird that lost its wings?" Natalie's eyes filled with tears. "I remember, Princess. You always asked me to tell it before bed." "Tell it again?" It was the first time Juniper had made a direct request to her mother since she had returned. Eleanor, who was observing the interaction from the kitchen door, felt her heart ache. She saw the genuine connection between mother and daughter rebuilding, and along with the joy for Juniper came the terror of losing her. Bennett, meanwhile, was dealing with growing complications in his business. The flood had caused significant damage to 3 of his major developments, and investigations into environmental irregularities were intensifying. What had begun as a routine investigation after the natural disaster was revealing deeper structural problems in some of his projects. "Mr. Sterling," said his chief engineer Paul Beggar during a tense meeting at the construction company office, "the inspectors found evidence that the fillings used in the Bella Vista residential project do not follow the approved specifications." "What do you mean?" Bennett asked, although part of him already knew the answer. "Cheaper, less resistant material. If it continues to rain like it has been, those buildings may have foundation problems in a few years." Bennett closed his eyes. The Bella Vista residential complex had been built exactly where the shantytown from which Juniper and Natalie had been removed used to be. The cruel irony of the situation hit him like a punch to the stomach. Who approved this change of material? Paul hesitated before answering. "The signatures are yours, sir, in the documents from 2019. "That's impossible. I never—" Bennett stopped in mid-sentence, a disturbing memory surfacing in his mind. 2019 had been the most difficult year of his marriage. Eleanor was undergoing the most invasive treatments to get pregnant. He was drinking more than he should, and he had delegated many operational decisions to his team. "Bring all the documents from that project," he ordered. "I want to review every paper that was signed." While Bennett faced the possibility that his past negligence could have devastating consequences, Eleanor was at the pediatrician with Hayes and Juniper, discovering something that would change everything again. "Juniper has a rare neurological condition," explained Dr. Charles West, after a battery of tests they had done to better understand the girl's exceptional memory. "It's called hyperthymesia. It's the ability to remember autobiographical details with extraordinary precision." "Is that dangerous?" Eleanor asked, holding Juniper's hand as she played with Hayes on her lap. "Not dangerous, but it can be challenging. People with hyperthymesia remember not only the events, but the emotions associated with them with the same intensity. Traumas can be relived constantly." Eleanor looked at Juniper with a mixture of fascination and concern. "And there's no treatment?" "There is no cure because it is not a disease, but with proper psychological support, she can learn to better deal with intense memories, especially traumatic ones." That afternoon, when they returned home, Eleanor found Natalie waiting in the living room with a tense expression on her face. There was something different in her posture, a determination that hadn't been present in previous visits. "I need to talk to you," Natalie said as soon as Eleanor and Juniper entered. "Alone, without Juniper." "Juniper, go play in your room for a few minutes," Eleanor said softly. "Then you can come down to see your mother." When the girl reluctantly went upstairs, Natalie turned to Eleanor with tears in her eyes. "I found out who had me committed," she said, her voice trembling with contained anger. "And I found out why." "Your cousin Marcello?" "It wasn't just him." Natalie took a deep breath. "It was a construction company that paid him to get me out of the way. They wanted the land where our house was for a new development." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "What company?" "Sterling Construction." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. The husband she loved, the man who had taken in Juniper out of gratitude and kindness, could have been directly responsible for the original separation between mother and daughter. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "I have the documents. The lawyer who helped me got copies of the payments made to Marcello, $50,000 to him to resolve the problem of the irregular occupation. Plus $20,000 when I was committed." Eleanor sat heavily on the sofa, trying to process the information. "Natalie, I swear I didn't know anything about this." "I know you didn't know. You've taken good care of Juniper. I can see that. But your husband—" Natalie's voice hardened. "Your husband destroyed my family, and now I want justice." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to sue the construction company, and I'm taking Juniper away with me today." "No!" The word came out of Eleanor with more force than she intended. "Please, think about Juniper. She's stable, happy." Happy in a house built with the money that cost my freedom, Natalie retorted. Happy with people who benefited from my suffering? At that moment, Bennett arrived home from work and found the two women in a tense argument. When he saw the expression on Eleanor's face, he immediately knew that something terrible had happened. "What's going on?" he asked. But the answer came in the form of a slap in the face that Natalie gave him before he could defend himself. "You destroyed my life," she shouted. "You separated my daughter from me." Bennett was stunned, more by the accusation than by the slap. "What are you talking about?" "The bribe you paid my cousin to commit me. The money you gave him to get me out of the way to build your luxury buildings." The accusation hit Bennett like a lightning bolt. He remembered the meetings of 2019, the decisions made by subordinates, the payments approved without question. He had outsourced so much that he had lost control over the methods used to solve problems. "Natalie, I didn't know the details." "Didn't know or didn't want to know?" She spat the words. "It doesn't matter. The result is the same. You destroyed a family to build your business." Juniper appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the shouting. She saw her biological mother yelling at Bennett, saw Eleanor crying on the sofa, and felt the world she had rebuilt collapsing again. "Why is everyone shouting?" she asked, walking down the stairs slowly. Everyone turned to look at the girl, and the silence that followed was filled with guilt and despair. How could they explain to a 4-year-old that the adults she loved were trapped in a web of guilt, greed, and consequences that had begun years before she could understand the world around her? "Princess," Natalie said, trying to control her voice, "we're leaving now, to our new house." "But I don't want to leave," Juniper said, looking desperately at Bennett and Eleanor. "I want to stay here with everyone." "Why can't everyone stay together?" Juniper's innocent question exposed the impossibility of the situation. How could they stay together when the truth had created an insurmountable abyss between them? How could Natalie forgive the people who had been indirectly responsible for her years of suffering? How could Bennett and Eleanor justify keeping Juniper, knowing the price that had been paid for her presence in their lives? The storm that had begun with a flood was far from over. Juniper's departure was like watching an accident in slow motion. Natalie packed the few clothes that the girl had accumulated during her stay at the mansion, while Eleanor desperately tried to convince her to wait at least one more day so they could find a less traumatic solution. "She needs to say goodbye to Hayes properly," Eleanor pleaded, holding the baby who had been crying non-stop since he felt the tension in the air. "They've developed a very strong bond." "My daughter has suffered too many separations in her life," Natalie replied firmly, although her voice trembled slightly. "The longer she stays here, the harder it will be for her to adapt to real life." Bennett remained silent in the corner of the room, devastated by the revelation of the last few hours. He had spent the entire afternoon reviewing documents from the construction company and confirmed his worst fears. His company had indeed paid bribes to remove families from areas it wanted to develop. He had signed the checks personally, but during a period when he was delegating so much that he didn't question the details. "Uncle Bennett," Juniper said, approaching him with her small steps, "are you sad because of me?" The simple question almost broke Bennett completely. He knelt down to get to the girl's height, struggling to find words that a 4-year-old could understand. "I'm not sad because of you, sweetie. I'm sad because adults sometimes do wrong things without thinking carefully about the consequences." "Did you do a wrong thing?" The brutal honesty of the question demanded an equally honest answer. "Yes, I did things that hurt your family even before I met you, and now I don't know how to fix it." Juniper studied his face with those dark, penetrating eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface. "My mother always said that when we do something wrong, we have to apologize and try to do the right thing afterward. That's what I'm trying to do," Bennett said, his voice choked. "But some things are very difficult to fix." At that moment, Hayes began to cry louder, a desperate cry that echoed throughout the entire house. Juniper broke away from Bennett and ran to Eleanor, reaching out her arms to take the baby. "He's feeling that I'm leaving," she said with a certainty that chilled all the adults present. "Let me calm him down before I go." Eleanor passed Hayes into Juniper's small arms, and immediately the baby stopped crying. The girl began to hum the same melody she sang every night, and Hayes snuggled against her as he always did. "You're going to be a very good boy, Hayes," Juniper whispered to the baby, "and when you grow up, you're going to remember Juniper who took care of you when you were a little guy. Okay?" The scene was devastating for everyone. Eleanor began to cry openly. Bennett had to turn away to hide his tears, and even Natalie felt her heart ache as she saw the genuine bond between her daughter and the baby. "Juniper," Natalie said softly, "we need to go now." "Can I come back to visit Hayes?" Juniper asked, handing the baby back to Eleanor. The silence that followed was charged with uncertainty. No one knew how to answer that question because no one knew what the future would be like after the revelations of that day. "We'll see," Natalie said finally, the standard answer of adults when they don't want to disappoint a child with the truth. Half an hour later, Bennett and Eleanor were alone in the mansion, which suddenly seemed too big and too silent. Hayes had finally fallen asleep after hours of crying, exhausted by the abrupt separation from the girl who had become his primary caregiver. "What are we going to do now?" Eleanor asked, sitting on the living room sofa where Juniper used to draw every morning. "I'm going to fix the mistakes I've made," Bennett said with determination. "I'm going to find out exactly what my company did. I'm going to compensate all the affected families, and I'm going to make sure Natalie has the resources she needs to rebuild her life. And Juniper?" "Juniper," Bennett paused, the pain evident in his voice. "Juniper will grow up knowing that there are people who love her, even if we can't be near her." Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Natalie and Juniper arrived at a small apartment that Natalie's lawyer had secured as temporary housing. It was a simple place with 2 small bedrooms, a cramped living room, and a basic kitchen, but it was clean and had the essentials. "This is going to be our new home," Natalie said, trying to sound enthusiastic. Juniper walked through the apartment in silence, her eyes registering every detail with her photographic memory. After weeks in the spacious mansion with gardens and huge rooms, the contrast was shocking. "Can I call Uncle Bennett to see how Hayes is?" she asked. "Not today, Princess, maybe tomorrow." But tomorrow turned into maybe next week, which turned into "we'll see." As the days passed, it became clear that Natalie did not intend to maintain any contact with the Sterlings. Juniper, in turn, was struggling to adapt to the new reality. She woke up every morning expecting to hear Hayes's cry, but found only silence. She looked for Eleanor in the kitchen, but saw only Natalie preparing a simple coffee. She missed the garden where she used to draw, the library where Bennett told her stories, the predictable routine she had learned to love. "Mommy," she said one night after 2 weeks in the apartment, "why can't we visit the family who took care of me?" Natalie, who was preparing dinner, stopped stirring the pan. Because sometimes it's better to leave the past in the past, Princess." "But they're part of my good past," Juniper insisted. "I like to remember the good things." "There are things you don't understand yet," Natalie said, turning to look at her daughter. "When you grow up, you'll understand why we can't go back there." But Juniper, with her extraordinary memory and keen ability to observe, was beginning to understand more than her mother imagined. She had recorded every word of the argument between the adults, every expression of guilt on Bennett's face, every tear from Eleanor, and she was processing everything with an intelligence that went far beyond her 4 years. 3 weeks after the separation, something unexpected happened. Juniper became seriously ill. It started with a high fever that didn't go down with common medications. Then came the seizures, the constant vomiting, and a lethargy that deeply frightened Natalie. At the hospital, Doctors discovered that the girl was suffering from severe malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies accumulated during her years on the streets. She needed specialized medical care a long time ago, explained Dr. Lewis, the pediatrician who examined her. Her neurological condition makes her body more sensitive to physical and emotional stresses. The abrupt change of environment may have triggered a crisis. But she was fine when she lived before, Natalie said, avoiding mentioning the Sterlings. She was stable, but not cured. Children who have experienced severe trauma need continuous medical care, good nutrition, a stable environment. Any big change can cause setbacks. The treatment that Juniper needed would cost more money than Natalie had or could afford in the near future. As she looked at her unconscious daughter in the hospital bed, connected to IVs and monitors, she had to face a painful truth. Her justified anger against the Sterlings might be harming the person she loved most in the world. It was in that moment of despair that a nurse approached her with information that would change everything again. "Ms. Santos, there's a gentleman at the front desk asking about Juniper. He said he's her uncle." Natalie closed her eyes, knowing exactly who it was. Bennett had found out about Juniper's hospitalization, and now he was there, probably ready to offer all the medical help the girl needed. Help that she couldn't refuse, even if it meant swallowing her pride and facing the man she considered responsible for years of suffering. The war between maternal love and the thirst for justice was about to reach its most critical point. Bennett had been sitting in the hospital waiting room for 3 hours when Natalie finally agreed to speak to him. Her eyes were red from crying, and she seemed to have aged years in the last few weeks. When she saw him, her first reaction was anger, but on closer inspection, she realized that he was also visibly shaken. "How did you know she was here?" she asked, sitting in the chair next to him without looking at him directly. "Dr. Lewis called me," Bennett replied. "I had asked him to let me know if Juniper needed any medical care. I left my name as an emergency contact before you left. You had no right to do that. I know, but I also knew that if something happened to her, I would never forgive myself for not trying to help." Bennett turned to face her. "Natalie, I know you have every reason to hate me, but right now Juniper needs care that costs more money than either of us has." "Either of us?" she repeated bitterly. "You're a millionaire, Bennett. Don't try to play the victim with me." "I'm not anymore," he said quietly. "The construction company is going bankrupt. The investigations into the irregularities have revealed problems in more than 20 projects. I'll have to compensate hundreds of families, including yours. My assets are frozen by the courts, and what isn't frozen I sold to start paying the compensations." Natalie looked at him in surprise. "You're broke." "Almost, but I didn't come here to ask for pity." Bennett took a deep breath. "I came to propose a deal. I'll pay for all of Juniper's treatment, the best doctors, the best care. In exchange, you let me be part of her life." "What do you mean?" "Supervised visits, a few hours a week. I want to be present when she needs me. I want to follow her development. I want to be a positive presence in her life." Natalie was silent for a long time, processing the proposal. The truth was that in recent weeks she had realized how much Juniper missed the routine and stability she had found in the Sterling home. The girl woke up every morning asking about Hayes, constantly drew figures of a family of 4, and had developed a melancholy that worried Natalie deeply. "What about Eleanor?" she asked finally. "Eleanor is going through a difficult time. Juniper's departure affected her a lot. Hayes cries constantly, can't sleep properly without having Juniper around. And Eleanor—" Bennett paused, choosing his words carefully. "Eleanor is discovering things about herself that are difficult to process." "What kind of things?" "She always had difficulty getting pregnant. She lost 2 babies before Hayes, something she never told me. When Juniper came into our lives, she finally felt complete, as if she had found the daughter she always wanted to have." Natalie felt a pang of something she couldn't identify. Maybe it was compassion. Maybe it was just tiredness from carrying so much resentment. "I don't trust you," she said honestly. "You shouldn't trust me, but trust the love you feel for Juniper. She needs medical care that I can provide, and more importantly, she needs the people she loves nearby during this treatment." At that moment, a nurse approached them. "Ms. Santos, Juniper has woken up and is asking for you. She can have visitors now." When they entered the room, they found Juniper sitting on the bed, still pale and weak, but with her eyes alert. When she saw Bennett, her face lit up with the first genuine smile in weeks. "Uncle Bennett," she said, reaching out her small arms towards him, "you came to see me." Bennett approached the bed and hugged her carefully, feeling how much thinner and more fragile she was than when she had left his home. "How are you feeling, sweetie?" "Better now that you're here. How's Hayes? Is he crying a lot?" "He is crying, yes. He misses you a lot." "I miss him too," Juniper said, and then she looked at Natalie. "Mommy, can I visit Hayes when I get out of here?" Natalie looked at her daughter, then at Bennett, and made a decision that would change the course of all of them. "Maybe we can arrange that," she said softly. During the following days, while Juniper recovered in the hospital, a strange but functional dynamic began to develop. Bennett paid all the medical costs and visited Juniper every afternoon, always respecting the schedule set by Natalie. Eleanor appeared once, bringing Hayes so that Juniper could see him, and it was devastating for everyone to see how the baby stopped crying instantly when he heard the girl's voice. "She has a gift with children," commented Dr. Lewis to Natalie after observing the interaction between Juniper and Hayes. "It's rare to see a child so young with such developed maternal instincts." "She's always been like that," Natalie replied. "Even when she was a baby, if she heard another child crying, she would try to console him in her own way." It was during these conversations with the doctors that Natalie began to better understand the complexity of Juniper's neurological condition. Hyperthymesia didn't only affect her ability to remember, it influenced her way of processing emotions, of relating to the world, of understanding the nuances of human relationships. "Children with this condition often have difficulty forming bonds," explained Dr. Lewis, "but Juniper seems to have developed an extraordinary ability to connect emotionally with other people. That's very rare and very valuable." "Valuable how?" "She can become an exceptionally empathetic and intuitive person, but it also means that she needs constant emotional stability. Abrupt changes, conflicts between people she loves, family instability, all of this can severely affect her development." The message was clear. Juniper needed peace, not war, between the adults in her life. 2 weeks later, when Juniper was discharged from the hospital, Natalie made a decision that surprised everyone, even herself. "Juniper will spend the weekends at your house," she announced to Bennett and Eleanor in the hospital waiting room. "During the week, she stays with me. On weekends, she stays with you." "Natalie," Eleanor began, but Natalie interrupted her. "This isn't for you, it's for her. She needs stability, and you're part of her stability now, whether I like it or not." "And the conditions?" Bennett asked cautiously. "First condition, you pay half of her school tuition and all medical costs. Second condition, I have the right to supervise everything that happens during those weekends. Third condition, if at any point I think this isn't working for Juniper, I'll terminate the agreement immediately." "I accept all conditions," Bennett said immediately. "Me too," Eleanor agreed, tears of relief streaming down her face. That was how an unofficial shared custody arrangement began, mediated not by lawyers or courts, but by the genuine love that everyone felt for a 4-year-old girl who had changed their lives in ways that none of them could have foreseen. But not everyone was happy with this solution. On the other side of town, Marcelo Santos, Natalie's cousin, watched the developments with growing concern. He had invested the money he had earned from the illegal sale of Natalie's property in risky businesses that were going wrong, And now, with Natalie back and seemingly well connected with influential people, he feared that his participation in the corruption scheme would be discovered. Marcelo knew he needed to act quickly to protect his interests, even if it meant causing more suffering for the niece he had helped separate from her mother. And he had a plan that would put Juniper at the center of an even more devastating battle. The first weekend Juniper was back at the Sterling mansion was like watching a family recovering from delicate surgery. Hayes, who had spent a month crying constantly, finally went back to sleeping peacefully when he heard the familiar voice humming in the next room. Eleanor, who had developed severe anxiety since the girl's departure, managed to relax for the first time in weeks. And Bennett, who had become a workaholic obsessed with repairing the damage caused by his company, allowed himself a few hours of peace watching Juniper draw in the garden. But the happiness was interrupted on Monday morning when Natalie arrived to pick up Juniper and found a man waiting at the door of the mansion. "Marcelo," she said, her voice mixing surprise and horror. "What are you doing here?" Marcelo Santos was a 42-year-old man, thin and slovenly looking, with small eyes that could never maintain eye contact for long. He wore a rumpled dress shirt and old pants, and there was something in his posture that immediately put Bennett on alert. "Hi, cuz," Marcelo said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I need to talk to you, and with these important people who are taking care of Juniper." "We have nothing to talk about," Natalie replied firmly. "You destroyed my life." "Oh, but we do, especially about Grandma Eulalia's inheritance that you think I sold illegally." Bennett approached, perceiving the growing tension in Natalie's voice. "Sir, I believe it's best if you resolve your family matters elsewhere." Marcelo looked him up and down with disdain. "You must be the rich guy who's funding all this. Very nice of you, considering that it was your company that paid me to resolve Natalie's little problem." Bennett's blood ran cold. Until that moment, he knew that his company had made questionable payments, but there was no confirmation that they were directly responsible for Natalie's commitment. "Oh, what are you talking about?" he asked, although part of him already knew the answer. $70,000, Marcelo said, savoring each word. "That's how much I received to convince my cousin here to sign some papers and then disappear from the map for a while. A lot of money for someone who had nowhere to fall dead." Natalie paled. "70,000? You told me it was only 5,000 to get government assistance." "I lied," Marcelo said with disturbing naturalness. "But it was all legal. I have the contracts here." He pulled a crumpled folder out from under his arm. "Contracts signed by Sterling Construction for social intermediation services." Bennett took the papers with trembling hands. There was his signature, authorizing payments to Marcelo Santos, social consultant, during the year 2019. Amounts that at the time seemed like normal operating expenses, but now revealed their sinister dimension. "Why are you telling us this now?" asked Eleanor, who had appeared at the door with Juniper in her arms. "Because now I need more money," Marcelo said simply. "I invested those 70,000 badly, and now I owe people who don't accept excuses." "And what does that have to do with us?" Natalie asked. "It has everything to do with it. You two," he pointed to Bennett and Natalie, "are creating a very pretty situation here. Shared custody, everyone's happy, the little girl growing up with two families who love each other. Very touching." Juniper, perceiving the tension, clung tighter to Eleanor's neck. Even without fully understanding the conversation, her extraordinary memory was recording every word, every expression, every nuance of the situation. "But I have information that can ruin all this happiness," Marcelo continued. "Information about how Sterling Construction really operates, about how many other families were harmed, about methods that would make you lose custody of the girl immediately." "Are you threatening us?" Bennett asked, his voice low but filled with rage. "I'm offering a deal, $50,000, and I disappear forever. You continue with your happy life, I solve my problems, everyone wins." "And if we refuse?" Natalie asked. Then I'll go to Child Protective Services and tell them that Juniper is living with people who deliberately destroyed families to profit. I'll show documents that prove that you knew about the company's illegal methods. I'll suggest that maybe it's not safe for a child to live in a house built with dirty money. The silence that followed was filled with horror and despair. Bennett and Natalie exchanged glances, recognizing that they were trapped in a trap that they themselves had helped to create. $50,000, Marcella repeated. You have a week to decide. And to show that I'm serious. He took his cell phone out of his pocket and showed them the screen. I've already scheduled a meeting with the social worker responsible for Juniper's case for Friday. If the money isn't in my account by Thursday, I'll go to that meeting with all the documents I have. After Marcello left, Bennett, Eleanor, and Natalie stood in the living room in silence, each processing the implications of the blackmail. Juniper had been taken to the backyard to play, but she was clearly disturbed by the tense atmosphere she had perceived among the adults. He's not bluffing, Natalie said finally. Marcello has always been capable of anything for money. But $50,000, Eleanor murmured. Bennett, do you have that money? No, he answered honestly. With all the compensation I'm paying, I barely have enough money for basic expenses. I'd have to sell the house. And even if we did, Natalie said, he would come back asking for more. People like Marcello never stop at the first payment. So what do we do? Eleanor asked, the despair clear in her voice. Bennett got up and began pacing back and forth, trying to think of a solution. There's another option, he said finally. We can tell the truth before he does. What do you mean? We can contact Child Protective Services ourselves, explain the whole situation, show how we're trying to repair the damage, demonstrate that Juniper is well cared for and happy. You're crazy, Natalie interrupted. If we tell them that you were responsible for my commitment, they'll take Juniper from us right away. Not necessarily, Bennett insisted. If we show that we recognize the mistakes, that we're paying compensation, that Juniper is thriving in this arrangement. It's too risky, Eleanor said. More risky than letting Marcello control our lives, Bennett retorted. While the adults were arguing, Juniper watched through the backyard window. Her precocious mind was processing fragments of the conversation she had heard, connecting information that a normal 4-year-old wouldn't be able to understand. She knew that there was some problem involving money, that the strange man was threatening her family and that everyone was scared. But Juniper also knew something that the adults didn't realize. During her weeks in the hospital, she had overheard conversations between doctors and social workers about her case. She had recorded in her extraordinary memory details about legal procedures, children's rights, and mainly about the importance of demonstrating that a child is in a stable and loving environment. That night, after Natalie took her back to the apartment, Juniper made a decision that would surprise all the adults in her life. She began to draw, not the colorful bird she used to make, but something much more complex and revealing. She drew Marcello with an evil expression, holding papers and pointing to her family. She drew Bennett and Eleanor crying and Natalie angry. And then, on a separate sheet, she drew something that she showed Natalie the next morning. "Mommy," she said, showing the drawing, "can I talk to the lady from the hospital, the one who asked about how I was being taken care of?" Natalie looked at the drawing and saw a surprisingly accurate representation of Dr. Grace Myers, the social worker who had followed Juniper's case during her commitment. "Why do you want to talk to her, Princess?" "Because she told me that if someone tried to separate me from the people who love me, I could tell her." Juniper looked at her mother with her big, serious eyes. "And someone's trying." At that moment, Natalie realized that her daughter had understood much more of the situation than any child should understand, and that perhaps, paradoxically, Juniper's extraordinary mind could be the key to solving a situation that the adults were finding impossible to solve. "Doctor," Grace Myers was accustomed to difficult cases during her 15 years as a social worker, but when Natalie called asking for an urgent meeting about Juniper, something in her voice alerted the professional. She knew the family well, having followed the case during the girl's stay in foster care, and she had been impressed by the progress Juniper had shown. "Ms. Santos, given the urgency of your call, I imagine something serious is happening," said Dr. Grace, when they met in her office the following morning. Natalie was clearly on edge, twisting her hands in her lap as Juniper quietly played with a few toys in the corner of the room. "It's about Juniper's safety. Someone is trying to blackmail us, threatening to use information to separate her from the people she loves." "What kind of information?" "It's complicated." Natalie took a deep breath. "You remember I mentioned I was involuntarily committed by my cousin?" "I do." "Well, we discovered he was paid by a construction company to remove me from the property where I lived with Juniper. And now the same company is looking after my daughter on weekends." Dr. Grace frowned. "How so?" Natalie told the whole story. The flood, the rescue, the discovery of the connection between Bennett and the destruction of her original family, the shared custody arrangement, and finally Marcelo's threat. "And now he's asking for $50,000 not to go to you with documents that could be interpreted as evidence that Juniper is living with dangerous people," Natalie concluded. Dr. Grace was silent for a long moment, processing the information. During her career, she had seen many cases where the circumstances were too complex to be judged by simple standards. "Ms. Santos, may I ask some direct questions?" "Of course." "Is Juniper being well treated at the Sterling's home?" "She is. They genuinely love her." "Is she happy with this arrangement?" "Very happy. It's the first time in years I've seen her truly stable." "And is Mr. Sterling trying to repair the damage his company caused?" "Yes. He sold almost everything he had to pay compensation. The company practically went bankrupt." Dr. Grace turned to Juniper, who had stopped playing and was watching the conversation intently. "Juniper, may I talk to you?" "Okay," the girl replied, approaching the desk. "Do you like living with your mum during the week and with Uncle Bennett on weekends?" "I like it a lot. It's like having two families who love me." "And do you feel safe with all these people?" "I do. They take care of me." Juniper paused and then said something that surprised both women. "But there's a mean man who wants to ruin everything." "What mean man?" "Mommy's cousin. He was yelling and saying he was going to tell lies about my family. He made Mommy cry." Dr. Grace looked at Natalie. Juniper overheard the conversation. She has a very special memory. She remembers everything in detail." "Juniper," Dr. Grace said gently, "can you tell me what you remember of that conversation?" Over the next 15 minutes, Juniper reported with astonishing accuracy every word she had heard, every expression she had seen, every nuance of Marcelo's threat. Her photographic memory reproduced the scene with a clarity that left Dr. Grace impressed and disturbed. "He said he was going to tell lies to you," Juniper concluded, "to make you take me away from my family. But I don't want to leave my family." After Natalie and Juniper left, Dr. Grace sat alone in her office, reflecting on the case. There was something deeply disturbing about the attempted blackmail, but there was also something touching about the way this unconventional family had formed through traumatic circumstances. She decided to take action outside of normal protocols, calling Bennett directly. "Mr. Sterling, this is Dr. Grace Myers, the social worker responsible for Juniper's case. I need to speak with you urgently." 2 hours later, Bennett and Eleanor were in Dr. Grace's office, visibly nervous. They had spent the past few days in agony, trying to find a way to get the money Marcelo demanded without success. "Mr. Sterling," Dr. Grace began, "Juniper's mother told me about the blackmail situation you are facing." Bennett paled. "Dr. Grace, I know how this must look. Actually, sir, I know exactly how it looks. It looks like a family that formed through extraordinary circumstances and is now being threatened by greed. Eleanor looked at the social worker in surprise. You're not going to take Juniper away from us? That will depend on your answers to some questions. Dr. Grace opened a file. Mr. Sterling, is it true that your company paid bribes to remove families from areas it wanted to develop? It's true. But at the time, I didn't know the specific methods that were being used. I delegated those operations to subordinates. Willful ignorance is still negligence, Dr. Grace said firmly. But what interests me is, what are you doing to repair that damage? Bennett took a folder of documents from his briefcase. I am paying compensation to all affected families. I sold my stake in other companies, sold properties, liquidated investments. The construction company is practically bankrupt, but compensation continues to be paid. Dr. Grace examined the documents, and specifically in the case of the Santos family, Natalie will receive compensation of $200,000, plus a property equivalent to the one illegally sold by her cousin. It's all documented. And what about Juniper's custody? We want what's best for her, said Eleanor. If you think the current arrangement isn't appropriate, on the contrary, Dr. Grace interrupted. From what I've observed, Juniper is thriving in this arrangement. She has stability, love, proper medical care, and most importantly, she feels safe and loved. Bennett and Eleanor exchanged glances, not believing what they were hearing. But there is a problem, Dr. Grace continued. This Marcelo Santos. He represents a constant threat to Juniper's stability. As long as he can use blackmail to manipulate you, the child's emotional security will be at risk. What do you suggest? Asked Bennett. That we face this legally. I will document the entire situation, including the attempted blackmail. I will recommend that the current custody arrangement be maintained, but with psychological counseling for Juniper to help her process the trauma. And Marcelo, attempted extortion is a crime. I will refer the case to the appropriate authorities. That afternoon, when everyone gathered again at Natalie's apartment to discuss Dr. Grace's decision, there was a sense of relief mixed with apprehension. Juniper, sensing the lighter mood, finally smiled. The first genuine smile in days. Does this mean I won't have to leave my family? She asked. It means we're going to fight to keep our family together, Natalie replied, hugging her daughter. But the peace was short-lived. That same night, Marcelo discovered through contacts in City Hall that Dr. Grace had opened a case against him. Furious and desperate, he made a decision that would put Juniper in real danger. If he couldn't get the money through blackmail, he would try another approach, one that involved kidnapping Juniper and demanding a ransom, betting that the two families who loved her would pay any amount to get her back. What Marcelo didn't know was that Juniper, with her extraordinary memory, had recorded every phone conversation he had made from Natalie's apartment when he thought no one was listening. And she was about to use that information in a way no adult could have predicted. The custody battle for Juniper was about to turn into a battle for her very safety. The call came on Tuesday morning as Natalie was making breakfast and Juniper was playing in the living room. The phone rang insistently, and when Natalie answered, the voice on the other end chilled her to the bone. "Don't make a sound, don't scream, just listen," Marcelo said, his voice tight and desperate. "I have Juniper with me." "What?" Natalie whispered, running to the living room. She found only toys scattered on the floor and the open window. "That's impossible. She was just here." "She's with me, cuz. And if you ever want to see your daughter again, you'll do exactly as I say." Natalie felt her legs buckle. How had Marcelo managed to enter the apartment and take Juniper without her hearing anything? "Where is she? If you hurt her..." "She's fine, for now. But that could change quickly if you don't cooperate." "What do you want?" $200,000. All the compensation money your rich boyfriend is going to pay you. You're going to call him right now and tell him you need the money in advance, today. "Marcelo, you're crazy. Bennett doesn't have that kind of money available. Then he'll get it. He'll sell what he needs to sell, borrow, do whatever it takes. Because if the money isn't in my account by 6 o'clock tonight, you'll never see Juniper again." The line went dead. Natalie stood in the middle of the empty room, trying to process what had just happened. Her daughter had been kidnapped by her own cousin, a man she had known since childhood, but who now seemed capable of anything. With trembling hands, she called Bennett. "Natalie, it's early for you to be calling. What's wrong?" "Bennett." She could barely speak. "Marcelo took Juniper." The silence on the other end of the line lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. "What do you mean, took her?" "He called me. Said he has her and wants $200,000 by 6 o'clock or—" Natalie couldn't finish the sentence. "Where are you?" "I'm coming over now." 20 minutes later, Bennett and Eleanor arrived at Natalie's apartment, accompanied by Dr. Grace, whom they had called immediately. The social worker took control of the situation with professional efficiency. "First thing, we're calling the police," she said. "No," Natalie cried. "He said if we involve the police." "Ms. Santos, kidnapping is a serious crime. We have to involve the authorities." "But what if he hurts Juniper?" Dr. Grace held Natalie's hands firmly. "Natalie, Marcelo is not an experienced criminal. He's desperate and acting impulsively. The police know how to handle situations like this." While Dr. Grace coordinated with the authorities, Bennett was mentally calculating his financial options. $200,000 was more money than he had readily available, but perhaps he could raise the amount by selling some personal assets quickly. "Even if I get the money," he said to Eleanor, "there's no guarantee he'll return Juniper. Desperate people like Marcelo rarely keep their word." It was then that Natalie's phone rang again. This time, to everyone's surprise, it was Juniper who was speaking. "Mommy, it's me. Juniper, my princess, are you okay?" "Where are you?" "I'm okay, Mommy. I'm in a place I remember. It's an old house near the river where we used to live. There's a big tree in the backyard and a broken fence." Dr. Grace signaled for Natalie to keep talking, while she quickly called the police with her cell phone. "Princess, is Cousin Marcelo with you?" "He is, but he's sleeping in the living room. He drank a lot and fell asleep." Juniper's voice was surprisingly calm. "Mommy, he's not very smart. He left the phone near me and didn't lock the door." Bennett moved closer to the phone. "Juniper, can you get out of the house?" "I can, Uncle Bennett, but I don't want to run away. He might wake up and get angry. And besides—" Juniper paused, and when she spoke again, there was something in her voice that showed an almost frightening maturity. "He's talking in his sleep. He's talking about hidden money and about other people he tricked like he tricked Mommy." "What kind of things?" Dr. Grace asked, approaching the phone. "He said names of other people who received money from Uncle Bennett's company, and he talked about an account in the bank where he kept the money he made selling Grandma's house. I memorized everything." The information left everyone stunned. Juniper, even in a kidnapping situation, was using her extraordinary memory to collect evidence against the man who had taken her. "Juniper," Dr. Grace said carefully, "can you repeat exactly what he said?" Over the next 10 minutes, Juniper related with photographic accuracy the confessions that Marcelo had made during his drunken sleep. Names, dates, amounts, bank account numbers, everything recorded in her precocious mind and reported with a clarity that impressed even the police officers who had arrived to coordinate the rescue. "This child is an exceptional witness," commented the officer in charge of the case. "With this information, we can not only solve the kidnapping, but also investigate an entire network of corruption." Meanwhile, in the abandoned house near the river, Juniper was executing a plan that she had formed using her street survival experience. She knew that Marcelo had drunk too much and would be unconscious for hours, so she had time to explore and find more evidence. In the drawer of an old table, She found papers that Marcelo had hidden, contracts, receipts, notes about other jobs he had done for companies that wanted to remove families from valuable properties. Her mind photographed each document, each number, each detail that might be important. When she heard Marcelo stirring in the living room, Juniper quickly returned to where she had been and pretended to be scared and helpless. But inside, she was calm and determined. She had learned over the years on the streets that sometimes the best way to survive was to appear weaker than she really was. "The girl still there?" Marcelo mumbled, waking up with a headache. "I am," Juniper replied in a small voice. "I'm scared." "Good. That way you don't do anything stupid." Marcelo looked at the clock. "Your families have 2 more hours to get the money. And if they don't, then we're going to have to travel far away from here. To a place where no one will find you." The threat was made with cruel naturalness, but Juniper did not flinch. She knew the police were coming. She had heard sirens in the distance when she was on the phone with her mother, and she knew her family would do anything to protect her. What she didn't know was that Marcelo had an escape plan that involved using a boat hidden on the river to cross into another state, where he had contacts who would help him disappear with Juniper until he could negotiate his freedom. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when the police surrounded the house, Marcelo realized he had been discovered. In a panic, he grabbed Juniper and ran to the backyard, toward the river where he had hidden the boat. "If you come any closer, I'll throw the girl in the water," he shouted, holding Juniper in a dangerous position on the riverbank. It was at this moment that Juniper used the last skill she had learned on the streets, the ability to take advantage of a moment of distraction to escape. When Marcelo looked back to see how many officers there were, she broke free from his arms and ran towards the familiar voices she heard calling her name. "Mommy! Uncle Bennett! Aunt Eleanor!" she cried, running towards the family who had come to get her. Marcelo tried to run after her, but he tripped on the slippery bank of the river and fell into the water. The police rescued him quickly, more soaked and humiliated than injured. When Juniper finally reached Natalie's arms, everyone was crying, with relief, with delayed fear, with gratitude that she was safe. But Juniper, with her precocious wisdom, knew that this experience had changed something fundamental in her life and in the lives of her family. "I have more things to tell you," she said to Dr. Grace, "important things that can help other children." And she was right. The information that Juniper had collected during her kidnapping would lead to the discovery of a corruption network that affected dozens of families, and her participation as a witness would help ensure that Marcelo and his accomplices faced the consequences of their actions. 3 months after the kidnapping, the consequences of what had happened continued to unfold like ripples in a lake after a stone is thrown into the water. Juniper had become a key witness in a lawsuit that revealed a much larger corruption network than anyone had imagined. Dr. Grace watched the girl during her weekly counseling sessions, impressed by the resilience she demonstrated. Juniper had not developed any apparent trauma from the kidnapping. On the contrary, she seemed to have gained a new confidence in her ability to deal with difficult situations. "Juniper," Dr. Grace said during one of these sessions, "how do you feel about helping to uncover the wrong things your cousin was doing?" "I feel good," Juniper replied, coloring a drawing that showed several happy families and beautiful homes. "He hurt a lot of people. Now they can have their homes back." "And how do you feel about your family? About living with your mum and visiting Uncle Bennett and Aunt Eleanor?" "It's the best thing in the world. All kids should have 2 families who love them." The simplicity of Juniper's answer hid the complexity of the arrangement that had been consolidated after the kidnapping. The traumatic event had, paradoxically, strengthened the bonds between all the adults in her life. Bennett, Eleanor, and Natalie had discovered that they worked better together than apart, and that Juniper thrived when she didn't have to choose between the people she loved. But not everything was resolved. Bennett faced serious financial difficulties. Sterling Construction had officially gone bankrupt, and he was using all of his personal savings to pay compensation to the affected families. The mansion where Juniper spent weekends was for sale, and they would have to move to something much more modest. "Uncle Bennett is sad," Juniper commented to Natalie one afternoon. "He tries to hide it, but I see it in his eyes." "Why do you think he's sad?" "Because he lost a lot of money helping the people his company hurt, and because he's afraid we won't like him anymore if he can't give us expensive things." Juniper's keen perception of adults' emotions continued to surprise everyone. Natalie decided it was time for a frank conversation with Bennett about the future. They met one Saturday afternoon in the park where Juniper liked to play. The girl was on the playground with Eleanor, who had become more relaxed and maternal after the traumatic events of recent months. "Bennett," Natalie said, sitting on the bench next to him, "Juniper realized you're worried about money." "She's very observant," he replied with a tired smile. "I'm trying not to let it affect the time I spend with her." "But it is affecting it. And not because you have less money, but because you're feeling guilty." Bennett was silent for a moment, watching Juniper laugh as Eleanor pushed her on the swing. "It's hard not to feel guilty. My negligence caused so much suffering for so many people. And now I'm broke, unable to offer Juniper the opportunities she deserves." "Do you think she cares about money?" "No, but I care. I want her to have the best education, the best medical care." "She has that," Natalie interrupted. "She has love, stability, people who care about her development. The rest is secondary." "But what if you two need something I can't provide?" Natalie looked at him with a serious expression. "Bennett, there's something I need to tell you. The compensation you're paying me, I'm not going to keep it all." "What do you mean?" "I'm going to use part of it to open a support fund for other families who went through what I went through. Families who were irregularly removed from their homes, children who were separated from their parents by corruption." Natalie paused. "And I want you to help me manage that fund." Bennett looked at her in surprise. "You want me to work with you?" "I want you to use your experience in construction to develop honest housing projects. Projects that actually help low-income families instead of evicting them." "Natalie, I know it sounds strange. The man who destroyed my family, working with me to rebuild other families. But I think that's exactly why it can work. You understand the mistakes that can't be repeated." The proposal left Bennett both moved and confused. "Why would you do this? Why would you give me a chance at redemption?" "Because Juniper taught me something. She taught me that sometimes the people who hurt you the most can become the ones who help you the most, if they've really changed." Natalie looked in the direction of her daughter. "And because I want her to grow up seeing that it's possible to fix mistakes, that it's possible to transform pain into something positive." 2 weeks later, something unexpected happened. Dr. Grace received a call from an investigative journalist who had followed the corruption case revealed by Juniper's kidnapping. "Dr. Grace, this is Sandra Oliveira from the National Journal. We are doing a story on the impact of the revelations made by Juniper Santos in the real estate corruption case. We would like to interview the family. I don't know if it would be appropriate to expose a 4-year-old child to the media." Dr. Grace replied cautiously. "I understand the concern, but their story can inspire other families who have gone through similar situations, and it can show how it is possible to rebuild relationships even after so much trauma." Dr. Grace spoke with Bennett, Eleanor, and Natalie about the proposal. After much discussion, they decided to accept, but with strict conditions to protect Juniper's privacy. The report aired on a Thursday night. It showed the story of the unconventional family that had formed through tragedy and redemption, the housing project that Bennett and Natalie were developing together, and most importantly, how a 4-year-old child had used her exceptional intelligence to help bring justice. The reaction was immediate and emotional. Hundreds of families who had gone through similar situations contacted them, asking for help. Businessmen offered investments for the housing project. And more importantly, other children who had been separated from their families by corruption began to be located and reunited with their loved ones. "Mommy," said Juniper one night, after watching the report on television, "a lot of people wrote us such lovely letters." "That's right. They liked our story. And now we're going to help other families stay together?" "Yes, Princess." Juniper smiled, and then she asked a question that touched Natalie's heart. "When I grow up, can I keep helping families who got lost?" "You can, honey. You can be anything you want to be." But while the family's life seemed to be finally finding a positive balance, not everyone was happy with recent developments. Some of the businessmen who had been exposed in the corruption investigation were organizing an attempt to discredit the witnesses, including Juniper. Dr. Grace received information that they were hiring lawyers to question the ability of a 4-year-old child to serve as a reliable witness, claiming her neurological condition made her an unreliable source of information. The legal battle that was to come would once again put Juniper's family under pressure, testing their newly formed union in ways none of them could have foreseen. And Juniper, even as just a child, would have to face questions about her own mind and memory in a court of law. The fight for justice was far from over, and the courage of a 4-year-old girl would be tested once again. The courtroom was silent as Juniper entered, accompanied by Dr. Grace. At 4.5 years old, she looked even smaller before the intimidating majesty of the courtroom. She wore a simple blue dress that Eleanor had carefully chosen, elegant enough to show respect for the court, but childish enough to remind everyone that this was a small child. The defense attorney for the accused businessman, Mr. Harrison Caldwell, a 60-year-old man with experience in discrediting witnesses, watched Juniper with calculating eyes. His strategy was simple: to prove that a child with hypothymesia could not be considered a reliable witness, as her neurological condition could distort her memories. "Your Honor," Mr. Caldwell said to the judge, "we question the ability of this minor to provide valid testimony. A 4-year-old child with a rare neurological condition cannot bear the responsibility of deciding the fate of respectable businessmen based on alleged memories." The prosecutor in charge of the case, Mr. Jeffrey Stone, stood up immediately. "Your Honor, the witness's condition does not diminish the reliability of her memories. On the contrary, medical studies prove that people with hypothymesia have exceptionally accurate memories." The judge, Judge Thompson, observed Juniper with curiosity and compassion. In 30 years of career, he had never dealt with such a young witness in such a complex case. "Has the child undergone psychological evaluation?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor," replied Dr. Grace, standing up. "I conducted extensive assessments. Juniper demonstrates exceptional emotional maturity for her age and the ability to clearly distinguish between reality and fantasy." "Very well. Let's proceed with caution and with all due protections for the minor." The judge addressed Juniper in a gentle voice. "Juniper, do you understand why you are here today?" Juniper looked around the room, her eyes registering every detail. The tense expressions of the lawyers, Natalie's nervousness in the gallery, the protective stance of Bennett and Eleanor. When she replied, her voice was clear and firm. "I understand, Judge. I'm here to tell the truth about the things I heard and saw, to help the families who were hurt like mine was." Mr. Caldwell began his interrogation by trying to confuse Juniper with questions about dates and chronology, hoping she would contradict herself. "Juniper, can you tell us exactly when you heard your cousin Marcello confess to the crimes?" "It was on March 15th, a Tuesday, at 2:23 in the afternoon," Juniper replied without hesitation. "He was sleeping in the living room of the old house near the river, and I was sitting on the broken wooden chair near the window." "And are you absolutely sure about the time?" "I am. The clock on the wall read 2:23 when he started talking. I looked because I wanted to know how long I had been there. Mr. Caldwell tried another approach. Juniper, when you were younger, did you sometimes confuse dreams with reality? No, she replied simply. I always knew the difference between dreaming and being awake. But don't you think it's possible that your memories are mixing different conversations you heard at different times? Juniper thought carefully before answering, an impressive maturity in her words. Sir, my head is like a very big library, where each book is always in the same place. I don't mix the books. Each memory stays on its own shelf. The simple but accurate analogy impressed everyone in the room. Mr. Caldwell realized that his strategy of confusing the girl wasn't working. Juniper, he tried one last time. Don't you think you might be making up some of these memories to please the adults who take care of you? It was then that Juniper demonstrated a perception that left everyone stunned. Sir, you are trying to make me look like a liar because you are afraid of what I remember. But I didn't make anything up. And you know that, because when I said the numbers of the bank accounts that my cousin said, you got very nervous. The silence that followed was eloquent. Mr. Caldwell had indeed been visibly disturbed when Juniper had mentioned specific numbers that exactly matched the bank accounts of the clients he represented. The prosecutor seized the moment. Juniper, can you repeat to the court exactly what you heard Marcelo say about those bank accounts? Over the next 45 minutes, Juniper reported with photographic accuracy the confessions she had heard. Names, amounts, dates, methods used to corrupt public officials. Everything reproduced with a clarity that left no room for doubt. He said he paid $15,000 to the city inspector to approve the construction on the land where the Silva family lived, she reported, and that he used the same method with 7 other families in the same region. The information Juniper provided exactly matched the documents that the investigation had discovered independently. It was impossible for a 4-year-old child to invent such specific and accurate details about complex financial transactions. When the interrogation ended, the judge addressed the lawyers. After hearing this witness, and considering the exact correspondence between her account and the documentary evidence already presented, this court considers the testimony of the minor Juniper Santos as highly reliable and relevant to this case. Mr. Caldwell tried one last resort. Your Honor, we request that the minor be subjected to new psychological examinations by independent experts. Denied, the judge replied firmly. The child has already been examined extensively. I will not subject her to more unnecessary stress. Furthermore, the accuracy of her statement speaks for itself. When they left the courtroom, Juniper was visibly tired, but satisfied. Did I do good? She asked Dr. Grace. You were extraordinary, the social worker replied. You helped ensure that justice is done. And now the other families will have their homes back. Many of them will, yes, thanks to you. 3 weeks later, the verdict was announced. All the businessmen involved in the corruption scheme were found guilty. Marcelo was sentenced to 8 years in prison. And more importantly, a reparations fund was established that would use the assets confiscated from the convicts to compensate the harmed families and build honest, affordable housing. Bennett and Natalie were appointed administrators of the fund, a decision that surprised many but made perfect sense. Who better to prevent corruption than someone who had lived through its consequences and someone who had redeemed themselves from participating in it? Uncle Bennett? Juniper said one afternoon while they were visiting one of the new housing projects they were building. You're not sad anymore. That's right, he replied, watching families move into decent and safe homes. I discovered that I feel much better helping to build than helping to destroy. And Aunt Eleanor is also happier. She is. She found a purpose working with children who have been through difficult situations like you. Eleanor had become a volunteer at a shelter for children separated from their families, using her experience with Juniper to help other traumatized children. Hayes, now over a year old, had become the unofficial mascot of the center, bringing joy to children who had forgotten how to smile. "And Mommy is also happy," continued Juniper. "She doesn't stay up at night worrying anymore." It was true. Natalie had found peace not only through justice, but through the meaningful work she was doing. Every family they managed to help, every child that was reunited with their parents, every honest home they built, was a small victory against the system that had almost destroyed her own family. But the most important victory was happening within Juniper herself. During months of therapy and medical care, she had developed tools to cope with her intense memories. She learned that her neurological condition was a gift, not a curse, and that she could use her extraordinary memory to help other people. Dr. Grace said that when I grow up, I can help other children who have been through difficult things, Juniper told Bennett. "Because I remember what it's like and I can teach them to be strong. I'm sure you will help many people, little one." "And will our family stay together?" "Forever," promised Bennett, hugging the girl who had changed all their lives in unimaginable ways. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Dr. Grace was finalizing her report on the most complex and rewarding case of her career. She wrote, "The case of Juniper Santos demonstrates that families can form in the most unexpected ways, and that true love can transcend the circumstances that initially separate people. This extraordinary child has not only found her own healing, but has become a catalyst for the healing of an entire community." The journey was coming to an end, but the impact of a courageous 4-year-old girl would continue to spread for years, touching lives and transforming destinies in ways no one could have predicted. 18 months had passed since the flood that changed all their lives, and the city of Charleston was waking up to another sunny spring day. Juniper, now 5.5, was sitting on the porch of the new house where her unconventional family had settled, a modest but welcoming residence that Bennett, Natalie, and Eleanor had bought together. The house had 4 bedrooms, one for Natalie, one for Bennett and Eleanor, one for Juniper, and one for Hayes, who now walked and said a few words, with Juniper being one of his favorites. The yard was small but well kept, with a garden that Juniper had insisted on planting and a swing that Bennett had built especially for her. "Mommy," said Juniper, calling Natalie, who was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, "is today a special day?" "It is, Princess. Today is exactly 1 year since our official family was registered. A year ago, after months of paperwork and hearings, they had managed to formalize a shared custody arrangement that was unique in the local legal system. Juniper officially had 3 legal guardians, Natalie as the primary biological mother, and Bennett and Eleanor as foster parents with custody rights. It was a document that had required the creation of a new legal category, inspired specifically by their case. "And today is also the day we open the new project," added Eleanor, joining the conversation while holding Hayes in her arms. The new project was the realization of a dream that had grown over months. Bennett and Natalie had used part of the resources from the reparations fund to open a support center for families who had been separated by situations of social injustice. The center offered free legal assistance, psychological support, and most importantly, a family reunification program that was becoming a model for other cities. "Can I cut the ribbon?" asked Juniper, referring to the opening ceremony that would take place that afternoon. "Of course you can," replied Bennett, appearing in the kitchen already dressed for the important day. "After all, you are our founding partner." It was true. Juniper had insisted on contributing to the center with her own drawings, which now decorated the walls of the place. They were colorful images of happy families, safe houses, and children playing, a stark contrast to the dark drawings she had made during her most difficult days. More importantly, Juniper had become a kind of informal ambassador for the project. Her story had inspired the creation of a special protocol for child witnesses in corruption cases, and her extraordinary memory had helped to identify and reunite other families who had been victims of similar schemes. "Uncle Bennett," she said, using the title she had kept even after the legal formalization of the family, "do you think we'll help a lot of families today?" "I'm sure we will." "And do you know why?" "Why?" "Because you taught us that it's possible to transform bad things into good things if we don't give up trying." During breakfast, they received a special call. It was Dr. Grace, who had become not only the social worker responsible for the case, but a dear friend of the family. "I have news that will interest you," she said, clearly excited. "The protection protocol for child witnesses that we developed based on Juniper's case has been approved as state law. It will be implemented throughout South Carolina." The news was received with celebration. It meant that other children in similar situations would have legal protections and specialized support, preventing them from going through the unnecessary traumas that Juniper had faced. "Does that mean that our work is helping children we don't even know?" asked Juniper. "Exactly," replied Dr. Grace. "Your courage is protecting children throughout the state." 2 hours later, the family arrived at the center that would be inaugurated. It was a simple but well-planned building located in the center of Charleston, easily accessible for families from all regions of the city. A sign at the entrance read, "Juniper Santos Family Support Center, where families reunite." Juniper looked at the sign with a mixture of pride and shyness. "Why did you put my name?" "Because you were the one who taught us the true meaning of family," replied Natalie, kneeling to be at her daughter's height. "You showed us that family is not about blood or conventions. It's about love, protection, and people who choose to care for each other." The opening ceremony was emotional. Dozens of families who had benefited from the reparations fund were present, along with local authorities, social professionals, and journalists who had followed the story from the beginning. When it was time for Juniper to cut the ribbon, she paused and looked at all the people gathered. "Can I say something?" she asked. "Of course you can," said the mayor, who had come especially for the ceremony. Juniper approached the microphone, needing Bennett's help to reach it. When she spoke, her small but clear voice reached everyone present. "I wanted to say that sometimes very bad things happen to families. Bad people separate children from their parents, take people from their homes, make everyone sad and scared." She paused, looking at her own family. "But I learned that when good people come together to help, good things can happen too. Families can find each other again. Children can have safe homes. And people who have done wrong can learn to do right things." The silence that followed was filled with emotion. Many of those present were crying, touched by the simple but profound wisdom of a child who had lived so much in so few years. "I hope this place helps many families stay together," continued Juniper, "and that no child needs to be alone and scared like I was." She smiled, that radiant smile that had become her trademark. "Because everyone deserves to have a family that loves them." When she cut the ribbon and the doors officially opened, it was as if a new hope spread through the community. The center was not just a place of assistance, it was a symbol that it was possible to rebuild, recover, and create something beautiful from the ashes of destruction. In the months that followed, the center became a national model. Delegations from other states came to visit to learn about the methods developed there. Universities began to study the case as an example of innovation in social work, and more importantly, hundreds of families were reunited and supported. Juniper, meanwhile, was growing and thriving. Her neurological condition, which was once seen as a problem, had clearly become a gift. She used her extraordinary memory to help psychologists better understand other traumatized children, sharing insights that only someone who had lived through similar experiences could have. "Dr. Grace," she said during one of her regular sessions, "I don't have nightmares about getting lost anymore." "Why do you think that's changed?" Because now I know that even when things get bad, there are always people who care. And that it's possible to find family in places we don't even expect. On a summer afternoon, exactly 2 years after the flood that had changed everything, Juniper was in the backyard playing with Hayes when she had a realization that she shared with Bennett. "Uncle Bennett, do you know what I found out?" "What was it, little one?" "I found out that that flood that almost hurt us was actually a good thing." Bennett looked at her in surprise. "How so?" "Because that's what made our family find each other. If there hadn't been a flood, you and Aunt Eleanor wouldn't have needed me to save Hayes, and I wouldn't have met you, and Mommy would still be sad and alone." Juniper thought for a moment. Sometimes the things that seem bad at the beginning are the world's way of bringing the right people together. The depth of Juniper's observation moved Bennett. Here was a 5-year-old child who had found meaning and purpose in experiences that could have destroyed her, and who was using her own healing to heal others. That night, when the whole family was gathered for dinner, a daily ritual they had established as sacred, Natalie made a special announcement. "You know how we always talk about how our family is special because we chose each other," she said. "Well, I wanted to formalize that in a new way." She took some papers from a drawer. "I talked to Dr. Grace and our lawyers. It's possible for Bennett and Eleanor to officially adopt Juniper while maintaining all my rights as a mother. It would be a joint adoption, something rare but legal." Juniper looked around the table at the people who had become her whole world. "Does that mean you would be my official parents too?" "If you want," said Eleanor, her voice choked with emotion. "I do," said Juniper without hesitation. "I want everyone to be my real family on paper too." And so, in a simple but deeply meaningful ceremony a few months later, Juniper Santos became officially Juniper Santos Sterling, daughter of 3 parents who loved her unconditionally and older sister of Hayes, who had learned to speak saying family as one of his first complete words. Dr. Grace, present at the ceremony as an official witness, later wrote in her final report, "The case of Juniper Santos Sterling demonstrates that true love can transcend any circumstance. A child who began her journey lost and traumatized has become the catalyst for the healing not only of her own family, but of an entire community. She proves that sometimes the greatest tragedies can turn into the greatest blessings when faced with courage, compassion, and a refusal to give up hope. And Juniper, now safe in the love of her extraordinary family, continued to grow, using her special memory not to relive traumas, but to remind everyone around her that no matter how lost someone may be, there is always a way back home. And sometimes home is something you build together with the people you choose to love. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story, giving a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.